Morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi everyone.
Good morning.
We're all dressed up, Narasimha.
Yeah, I have to uh, be on a panel right after this.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. And it's a little cold in my office. I came thinking it's going to be summer weather. Doesn't quite feel that way.
What's the panel about?
Energy transitions. It's Earth Day. It's Earth Day celebration. So
Ah, okay.
yeah.
I guess I should have been aware of that.
Okay, I feel uninformed.
Mhm.
What are you going to tell people? Is there hope?
Focus on the demand side. Focus on justice. Don't just think about technologies.
Mm.
Mm.
Oh, you're great at sound biting.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's kind of the reason for my existence in this department. So I better at least have those sound bites.
Are you the one person that's really good at writing journal highlights and abstracts and keywords and things like that? I always struggle with
I
those.
always struggle with those two. I do like to frame papers, but yeah, those are the things to write at the complete end. It becomes much easier.
Yeah, for sure.
Morning, Chris, Stacy. Wow, we've got a full house today. This is so exciting.
That's great. Oh, we're all here. Okay. We should start.
Yeah, so a couple of things, if you don't mind me taking the time,
Oh
Narasimha.
yeah, go ahead.
Just the first question, people out of town or town, of course, centered around us, people who are not in Fort Collins, do you have a sense of when you might arrive for the in-person meeting? I just want to know, particularly if we should do a Monday evening dinner. And then
What's
if people,
Monday? What's the date? I can look at
the 13th. So that's
Yeah,
the
yeah. So Karthik and I are arriving on the 13th.
Mhm.
So we could do that.
And you guys are getting in like 5-ish to the airport.
Four is the flight. Yeah. So
Okay, so you could, are you renting a car?
I don't know. I have to figure that out.
Okay,
Maybe
because
that's better.
that matters how long it takes.
Last time we did it with Ubers and
You did?
Yeah. We got like a shuttle thing, like
we took a shuttle in, the hotel shuttle in, and then we took Uber back.
Uber back. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, so you don't have to know now, and then Chris, I don't know what your plans are going to be. Maybe you could give us a hint if you know, and if you don't, that's okay, no pressure. And you too, Stacy.
Yeah, I'm not positive yet. I know that Wednesday, I know more about when I have to take off, than when I can arrive, but I don't, I think I'm fairly flexible for arriving. Although it'll either be, I would say don't count on me for dinner Monday night, but I'll certainly be there as early as I need to be on Tuesday morning, and then Wednesday I think I need to head out around 2.
Okay, we're probably planning to end around 12 or 1 because
Okay.
people will have flights out that day so they can get home that night.
Okay.
Tammy, so I'm planning on taking an early Monday morning flight. So that's pretty limited. So I should be in Fort Collins by the afternoon, early afternoon.
Okay.
And then I'm still, I don't have the tickets yet, but I haven't figured out the Wednesday plan. The thing with going back to Champaign is that I can either do a 2:30 flight in the afternoon on Wednesday or like a 8:30 p.m. flight that gets home 17 hours later.
Oh no.
um,
Not a
So yeah, anyway, so I feel like even if I had a 2 p.m. flight on Wednesday, I'd have to leave in the morning by 10 or 9:30 to make it back to the airport.
Okay, so
So
we don't
maybe I'll
need to
just try and
do,
figure out how to stay until
yeah,
Thursday.
it sounds like people are kind of loose on Wednesday. There may be enough people that we should plan a Monday evening dinner with a sort of porous boundary. And then we'll sort out Wednesday. The people who live here know a fair bit more about how to get to the airport efficiently than people who don't live here. So let's hear about flights and we'll talk to you offline.
Okay, that's great. If someone can send me recommendations on how long it takes to the airport, that would be great.
Yeah, well, and also depending on when people's flights are, it can be more efficient to just get a car and have everybody in it and return
Yeah,
it.
so maybe let's start an email chain or something about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we don't have to do that here. But we can help you. You don't have to figure it all out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and the other thing I wanted to raise, as I said in my email, is Paul is putting together an NSF civic planning grant. The civic mechanism, first, it's small. The planning grant is a short period of time, like 6 months, but it is planning for a pretty large project, like $1 million over a year. And his idea is to work with community partners, including people who are doing housing projects, community college in Pueblo, Chris, so that may be relevant to you, and to do in-field measurements of heat pump efficiencies and identify some of the issues. Now, that's not exactly up our alley, but I think he asked me if we could write a letter of support, just saying, if you find anything, then we'll try to include it in our models. I think that's a good thing for us, because it might provide some of the connections that we might want to explore with contractors and communities and so on. It anyway, so I wanted to check with y'all if it was okay if I wrote him a letter of support. It's not just my project, so I wanted to ask for your approval or any objections.
I think that sounds great. And I'm happy to help write something, because I think like with some of the stuff Chris and I have talked about, that would be really helpful. So
Cool. Yeah, that might be, it might be better, right? Because you're in it. Okay, I want to leave the rest of the time for Narasimha to talk about his long-awaited heat pump review. And you should be able to share your screen if you want to.
Thanks. Yeah. This is not very formal, and I haven't made as much progress as I wanted on all the usual caveats, but I do want to share what I have. I do want to get some feedback on a couple of questions. So here we go. Okay, so do you see my screen? I assume so. Okay. Yeah. I wanted to first just present my general outline and approach for this paper. I have 3 major sections for this paper, the way I've been thinking about it. The first is thinking about reviewing the literature, mainly in the social sciences, I guess in the energy social sciences, on the state of knowledge about heat pump adoption behavior. So specifically trying to understand from fieldwork, from surveys, what do people understand to be the decision factors, the decision-making processes around heat pump adoption? What can we synthesize as the key findings from that? To what extent are they generalizable? Second section is reviewing the modeling literature to understand what's the state of the art and how current adoption decisions are modeled for heat pumps. And the third puts them together by saying, well, the goal of the models is to try and produce realistic models for decision rules based on what we understand in the literature. How do they stack up against each other, and how should we move forward? Can we make incremental changes to models? And how do we think about longer term, deeper integration, about drawing from the literature that we know or having to do more fieldwork? So those are the three sections. I've done the first two, and I've left the hard part for now. But I do have some ideas for what could be incremental and what could be deeper work. And the incremental part, in fact, Shangwei is implementing some of them with NEMS right now. So it's a lead into some of that. Okay, so my approach in each of the three sections, in the state of the knowledge, is a little bit more traditional. I haven't been as systematic as Ellison was in terms of doing a formal keyword search, looking at the number of articles and winnowing them down. I need to perhaps go back and do that. That's one of my questions to you, how important that is. The literature is so small, actually, focusing on heat pumps, that it's, I've just been snowballing to all the papers that I know of in Europe and the US. So I'm pretty sure I have all the papers, but I could go back and make a little bit more of a formal search and presentation as part of it. But I have tried to be a little bit comprehensive. I have looked at the US and Europe. I've tried to emphasize the US. So the paper would ultimately be focusing on the US because context matters. And I'm just drawing on Europe to the extent I think it's applicable. I am not drawing on the much larger adoption literature on rooftop PV and broader energy system upgrades, energy conservation measures, energy efficiency upgrades. There are some similarities more with the ESM literature than the rooftop PV, which I describe a little bit, but I ultimately justify leaving them out because there are enough differences that would require in each case an assessment of the applicability of those particular upgrades to the heat pump context in the US, which is just out of the scope. So I leave that out. And there are two types of literature. One of them, as I think we've discussed before, one of them concerns actual fieldwork and surveys about adoption decisions, which is the most relevant literature, of which there are not many studies, and they're dominated by European work. And the second are more statistical studies of ownership from representative surveys in countries. I have mostly in the US, including my own work. They have their pros and cons. The former is much more directly about our question in this paper, but it's not easily generalizable. So the external validity is questionable. The statistical studies are more generalizable because they're large representative samples, but they don't look at the decision process. They're looking only at ex post ownership data. So we can only have suggestive, correlates of people having something versus not. And Christina's work maybe falls a little bit in between. We don't look at decisions, but we're at least looking at the conditions around the time that they made the decision. Okay, the second section, my approach actually has not been comprehensive. There's too many models out there, and getting to the weeds of each one is really cumbersome. I decided that use some expert judgment and focus on the best practices in each of the important areas of the decision rules. So as I'll show you in each section, I've picked models, and there's a total of four models that I'm drawing on for all of the examples. Two in the US and one in an integrated assessment model that's global, and one that's more European. The GCAM and NEMS being the two US models. And then my approach and the way forward, like I said, is still to be decided, but it's mainly looking at incremental versus deeper changes. The incremental being something I think modelers could do today, and the deeper is calling for changes in research processes more deeply. Okay, so what do we know from the literature? Slim pickings. I mean, I was really disappointed. there's very little, in fact, that's generalizable. But I separated the state of knowledge into the two parts of the decision. The first concerns what drives people to want to change their heating equipment in the first place, which we know is an important first step. And the second step is the actual decision-making process for selecting the right choice, and specifically moving away from the default option, which is to continue with what you had before. So in terms of the trigger decision, it seems to be the case that from the few studies that have looked at this, and literally I'm talking about 1 or 2 or 3 studies, that there has to be some dissatisfaction with the present system, that people, unless there's a reason to be dissatisfied, so there has to be some kind of change that motivates the thought about a new system. And the idea of a useful life, to me, is not helpful. It still begs the question, because there's enough variation in the useful life depending upon the conditions of use, the particular technology, that you could run your thing into the ground if there's never been a problem, and you may have to cut it short and change equipment very soon if something goes wrong with it, and if the maintenance cost or repair is higher than a new system. So the useful life as a guidance is not so useful, because the point is what triggers your view as to what is not useful anymore, when it's not useful anymore. Okay, so what drives people to be dissatisfied? Usually it's equipment breakdown, a change in cost. So it's some problem. But there is a case where if people talk about a new opportunity that may be significant enough to drive them to switch. Now that new opportunity, I've learned that just information is not enough. Now, the lack of information is a barrier. So people who don't know much about new equipment, they tend to stick to where they are, or stick to the equipment that they had. So just having knowledge about new technologies is not enough to switch to a new technology, to a new fuel. But it seems to at least be a necessary condition. Apologies, I skipped a small step. So once you're dissatisfied with the equipment and you want to change it, the default behavior is for people to get the equipment they had before. So most people will just get the same technology again. So it's not only that something has to go wrong, but you have to have this ample reason and impetus to consider switching to a new technology if you're going to move to heat pumps. So that's quite a high bar for people to move. Now, moving house seems to be one impetus where people would consider a new technology. Okay, so that's what I've learned about the decision.
Can
Then,
I ask a question about that moving
Yeah.
house? So I guess it's kind of weird to me, because when I'm moving, which has only been a couple times, and I'm n=1, I'm broke, right? It's like the time when I have the least money. So why is it then that people decide to replace things? Is it that they're moving into a place that has something unsatisfactory, or maybe your review did not pick this up? But I guess I try to do like the least amount possible, unless maybe you're buying a fixer-upper. Or maybe I'm too far in the weeds here, but I would just like to understand this a little more, like what is people's general mindset when they have this expansive version of moving?
Yeah, so not a single study I've seen is actually is about that moving process and how you think about equipment changes. It's just that in the surveys that have been done, one of the factors that comes up is when they move, they tend to be more receptive to changing. So there's nothing that I can tell you from the survey, my review to inform your question. I would just say that I think there's multiple perspectives. Even you're being anecdotal, I'm being, from my perspective, I could see it the other way. People are, dealing with a gigantic sum of money that you don't deal with for any other decision in your life. And, when you're dealing with that gigantic sum of money, then perhaps the cost of equipment, heating equipment change may be an order of magnitude less. And it's, you have set aside money for that mortgage and that whatever for that down payment, and you're
Mm.
willing to consider changes that are all part of that, right? So in some ways, I feel it's folded into a
Mm.
much bigger amount, and so I can see it as being something myself, actually.
That's fair. And
as
that
part
might
of-
fit in Rydul's, the sort of equivalent, like what, I don't remember what he called it, but the uncertainty band where everything looks equivalent at a certain point.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's kind of like that. Yeah. And then the other thing I'd say, maybe Christina has, from Christina's work, we know that movers, we are tracking movers, and I don't know how they show up in the statistical analysis, but one could try and look at conditions around the move. But I don't think statistical data will really give you enough insight. So yeah, I don't know. I also don't know what else could motivate people to want to. It could be environmental attitudes, for example. But that all of that stuff comes up in the selection of the choice of technology. But the move to actually change your equipment and to switch to a new technology, I'm not seeing enough other than this as guidance, as insights. So it's a gap. Okay. So then we come to the fuel equipment selection, which generally go together. Most of these are from European studies, and literally each one points to a couple of different factors. And we're talking about 5 to 7 studies: Ireland, Germany, Spain or Portugal, UK, Sweden. There's just a bunch of individual studies in a bunch of different countries. The only thing I've found more common than other factors is cost. So cost considerations tend to rise up to the surface in terms of, or to the top of people's set of factors. But which aspects of cost itself is not so clear. It could be, I value the savings a lot. It could be, I didn't have the upfront money, so the high cost was a deterrent. I've never, there's only one study that talks about actually people expressing their cost concerns in terms of a payback. Literally, I don't even see that. But it also could be because people are not asking questions like that. In these studies, they're not asking, "Are you considering your payback?" I've not seen that. So all I can say is cost considerations are common and tend to be of high priority when multiple factors are listed. Okay, besides that, there's a number of different factors that come up in different studies, depending upon what's been asked about. So reliability of the system is important. People's sense of comfort seems to be important. In one study, it seemed that the desire to be independent from fossil fuels was important to switch to a heat pump. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an environmental attitude. It could have been something about buying a fuel, the price volatility. I'm not sure. It could have been multiple factors associated with purchasing gas or oil. Risk aversion, this may have a little to do with the information, but it also could have to do with the idea of innovation and diffusion theory around embracing new technologies and innovation. So this is the traditional Rogers diffusion theory. Early adopters basically would be willing to consider heat pumps because they're a little less risk averse in terms of a new technology. Really, the overall learning from this is not much generalizable stuff, but most interesting was how this information was obtained in the surveys. I'm seeing that people are asking more about what are your decision factors that play a role, not the decision-making process. That's a big insight for me. People are not asking about or trying to flesh out a process or a sequence of steps, or how do you put all these factors together. I'm more hearing just what are the factors and what are the priorities that influence the decision. So in that sense, I start to get sympathetic from this review about what models do. You know, and I'll get to later on. You know, okay, what do we do about it if we were in the position of researchers? Okay, so then okay, I'll stop here for a second just to hear what your reactions to this. I'm switching gears next to what the models do.
Just a question. Do we know the extent to which developers, when they're building new homes, are installing heat pumps? This is a little bit, I suppose, a little bit navel gazing, but in Fort Collins, there's a cluster of homes with heat pumps, and some of the data that I have, and I'm pretty sure they were like sustainably built. Like people didn't make a decision. In other words, they made the decision to buy the home, but the heat pump came with the house. So I don't know to which that's a, you know, that's a consideration as well. I suspect that it's really rare for developers to put heat pumps in new homes. That probably doesn't affect. Presumably, these surveys uh, are done in such a way where they're trying to select people who have considered a heat pump. So I don't know if you have any sense of that. You also had mentioned something about, I think you were kind of like implicitly referencing sort of like an attitude behavior gap, where there's some studies that are showing like an interest in heat pumps, but maybe less that have looked at the actual decision. And I suspect if those are probably kind of retrospective, or where we're asking people to recall why they made the decision to install a heat pump or not, as opposed to, something that kind of occurs in real time. I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
Yeah, so thanks. The first question, that's a really fascinating idea. I think I don't know much about. First of all, that's not something that comes up in the review because new construction, new homes, like I said, were not part of any of the studies I've looked at. I don't know of that happening of heat pumps being bundled in real estate, but I can totally see that happening because there's a lot of literature on how air conditioning started to get bundled in real estate way back in the 50s and 60s as it started to get popular. And I can completely see it's almost the same thing, right? You have a duct system, you have a AC, but you just have a heat pump instead of the AC, and the house is set up for heating and cooling. So I can imagine I would look in the mid-Atlantic and Florida and Arizona, places like that, where you have high penetration of heat pumps. That's where I would look at new construction and new homes to see if that's happening. But it's a great thought. It's a great thought. I think we should find that out. The second question, no, I didn't exactly say that. There is a lot of literature in general in the energy, home energy upgrade literature on this attitude action gap, intention action gap. But I didn't pick that up. I was just saying that the desire to be independent from fossils was something, but it wasn't clear. That was literally the finding of what the people said in the survey. But what I was just saying is I don't think that necessarily implies it's an environmental attitude issue. It could be literally prices or volatility. So no, there was nothing on attitudes, which was surprising to me too. I didn't find a lot of insights from these studies, as in I didn't see people mention that as a imperative for switching to heat pumps. That I wanted to protect climate change. It's never come up in these studies, but that's just a handful of studies. So I don't know if that means too much. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Any others? Comments also? Or suggestions? Anything would be fine. Okay, I'll move on and you can ask again later. So what do the models do? So there are three types of models. This is one of the things I came up with in terms of how to group models. Actually, this is not how it's done in the literature. I decided to group models based on how they represent household decisions, actually, and scale and scope of how they represent adoption. The first category is market allocation models. So this is the traditional NEMS and GCAM. These tend to be integrated assessment models. They have single representative homes. Essentially, they model the entire residential sector as one. And their goal is just to represent market shares for different technologies for heating equipment. In fact, there's no real decision that's modeled, it's more implicit. And from 2 or 3 papers, I think I could glean this kind of a structure. You know, it's a structure, standard mathematical way to, develop shares, or the odds of having one technology over others. You may recognize it's like the form of a logic model. And they would have the structure where you have share for a particular technology J, divided by that expression for all of the options, the heating equipment options. And you have embedded in that, you could have a set of covariates, maybe demographic or urbanization rates or something. But the fundamental in there is the life cycle cost, something to do with the cost. Almost like a payback, but not quite. It's like, what's the net present value? What's the life cycle cost taking into account upfront cost as well as the operating cost? And then, most importantly, you have a couple of parameters, this B or beta parameter and the A. These are kind of knobs that modelers have that allow them to tune the share of technologies to the current market. And this is what would otherwise be called the winner takes all behavior. Because let's say in a particular time frame, a new technology becomes viable, all of a sudden you can't have the entire market shift to that new technology. Because for multiple reasons, that new price, that new payback is not, first of all, experienced by all participants in the market. Markets are fragmented. Some people see the new prices, other people don't. So you have a fragmented market, you have decision barriers, you have information barriers, but none of this is modeled. So what modelers do is they have a single parameter or 2 parameters that they calibrate to the existing market shares. And those stay constant into the future. And some people nuance those so that they do change in the future a little bit based on market shares, which is good. The Times model does that. But generally, every one of these market allocation models, which really is the bulk of the models used in the projections literature for climate futures, uses this life cycle cost as a basis, as the only decision rule, and they do it in terms of these market shares. And NEMS is the only one I find that actually separates the first stage. They actually have a market, what they call a replacement market. And only within the replacement market, you then have those who stick with the current fuel, and only after you consider that, do you have those who consider alternative technologies, and only that subgroup will consider these different market shares. Tammy, before I go on, you have a question.
Yeah, so can you clarify the market allocation? Are they working on the current allocation, or are they working on only that fraction that has made a decision in the last time step? Like when you produce these shares, or when the model produces these shares, is it like, here's the share throughout the whole population, or does this represent a discrete choice model of the people who are now choosing to get something new?
Right. So, like I said, it's only in the case of NEMS that's the case.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I
in
didn't understand.
in the
Okay.
NEMS case,
Okay.
they take the overall population, and then they take some percentage that are going to replace their equipment, and then some small percentage of that are going to change the technology and fuel. And only they will evaluate what shares will be allocated to technologies based on the life cycle cost.
Okay.
And those shares are, they determine the value of those parameters so that, given the costs, you'll get the shares today in the baseline. And then in the future, those parameters stay constant. And as the life cycle cost changes based on differing costs of technologies, the shares will be tweaked towards one or the other, but they'll only be tweaked because these bias parameters are fixed, and they kind of restrict how much you can change.
Okay.
Which to me is a problem, because people's attitudes, people's preferences may change as technologies get more popular, right? And those they don't have any room, any place for that dynamism. So these models are not dynamic, except to the extent that they project the changes in costs. And what I'd like to do in my work with Shangwei is to find out how much sensitivity these parameters have compared to the sensitivity you get from changing costs. Because we don't know that. Nobody's done that sensitivity. How much of the decision, how much of the shift in the market shares can result from the non-economic factors that are buried in this bias parameter. So that's something that I'll mention in the review paper as in the way forward, and we'll actually do it hopefully with NEMS. Okay, the second category of models is a little bit like what ResTalk does. It's basically building simulation models. It's more architectural and engineering models, as opposed to energy economic modelers who are doing climate futures. These are very detailed models where people are trying to simulate operational energy or operational costs in different circumstances and trying to get it right. And so there are different scale of modeling. They're modeling buildings, homes, but they're not concerned about the adoption decision. So most of these papers, almost all these papers, are just focusing on operational conditions, efficiencies of technologies, etc. In the case where they need to consider adoption because they're doing the simulation over multiple time periods, they use a simple payback, economic payback, like ResTalk, like in the Joule paper. They just do a net present value in order to determine what technology is adopted in the future, and then they focus on the operation of those groups of technologies. So they don't offer much guidance on adoption, that set of models. The last set of models that is by design the most useful are the agent-based models, because they are intended to try and flesh out the influence of various decision-making factors. And usually these agent-based models are tied to a survey. They have a survey on the basis of which they can draw out some of these factors. So in some cases, they do a survey to calibrate the agent-based model. In other cases, they just exist already. But those surveys were done with a specific intent. So they ask specific questions about specific sets of factors, whether it's psychological factors, maybe it's peer effect factors. But all of them ultimately, theoretically, they have two commonalities. One of them, they assume this kind of utility function that has different components to them that are linearly additive components and that have weights. And the second is, to the extent they adopt some kind of behavioral theory, it's usually the theory of planned behavior. It's a rational choice approach, but it's a little bit constrained by people's sense of agency, sense of control. And so they have some attitude about the agency, and we could incorporate certain attitudes towards an inertia to change, for example. So I group these into psychological factors. The economic factors I already mentioned. And the third is social factors, which I can basically the interaction between people. How are you influenced by other people having heat pumps? That's a peer effect, a neighborhood effect. Sometimes it's based on questions. Sometimes it's based on just an assumption that exists and using spatial proximity as a basis for coming up with that. And so here in this case, Raidul has helped me compile an actual systematic review of these agent-based models. And I've synthesized the nature of the findings in just a couple of paragraphs, but I also have a table, that Raidul and I have put together. And I didn't want to get into the details of what's in the rows. I just wanted you to focus on the headers of the columns. This is what I thought would be information that we should put in here. Of course, the source of the paper, to what extent they're focusing on heat pumps versus just general heating technologies. So how are they framing the question? I've called it unit of analysis. It may not be the best term, but what are they? The adoption of what is that question? And then the next one is probably the most important: is how are they representing behavior? What aspect of behavior are they trying to uncover? And if there's any theoretical basis, I'm putting it in here. The utility function is also equally important because they have to translate that into math if they're going to model it. And that math is always this very standard utility function, as far as I can see. A weighted set of factors that are just assumed to give you utility. The empirical basis, so what kind of survey are they relying on? So validation is an important point, but doesn't get populated very much. Because the idea is they use a survey to try and calibrate the model, right? To determine what are these factors, what are the weights, in order to drive the future interaction of the household members in that model. But then the question is, how do you test out your result in, for the future data point? Do you have a separate survey of adoption, levels that you can then test out against? That's the validation question. And most of them don't have anything, but there are a couple that do. The interaction variable is unlike the behavioral influence, which is focusing more on the psychological factors. The interaction variable is simply this peer effect. Do they include one? How do they model it? And then the emergent property is, okay, what did we learn from the study? What did they get from it? That's the hardest one because it's difficult to summarize and it kind of stretches each of the rows. So as a presentation, I was not sure how useful it is. I wanted to put this out there because as a reader, I tend to my eyes glaze over big fat tables, I never look at them. I just look at the summary and the discussion off the table in the text. But I don't know, I wanted to put that out there. Is this useful? And this would cover all the 10 or 11 studies that we are focusing on. Okay, so before I move to what to do next, I'm just going to pause over here for a second. There's 3 types of models. The market allocation, it's got these bias parameters. The building simulation models are not very helpful. And the ABMs have a similar kind of a structure. They don't have any common single insights across them, except peer effects seem to matter, I would say. Psychological factors matter. Knowledge information share matters. So they kind of verify some of the factors I said in the literature earlier, seem to emerge. But I'm not showing you all of them here, and I haven't, I can't go through all of them. And Raidul, please feel free to add anything if you feel it's important to say. You don't have to either. There's a lot of chat. I just realized there's a whole bunch of chat comments. Should I go to your questions in there? Oh, okay. Well, let me finish. I can't multi-process right now. Let me just finish the presentation and then maybe
Yeah,
I'd
maybe
ask.
we can come back to those later because I think not all of them are directly at you, or you can respond by email. And the question I posed is not, I don't feel like it needs to be answered in the meeting.
Okay. So what to do next? Okay, incrementally, I think models can try to implement, a first stage. I think as we're doing, we're implementing based on age distribution, at least to restrict the size of the market with real data. I think models can try to include some amount of heterogeneity because that's really important. People behave differently, even just in the economics. They may have different discount rates. They may see different prices. You have to have multiple household groups. So I'm going to recommend that strongly. Shang Wei is going to try to implement 2 income groups and DEMS, although it's going to be really hairy. The third is experiment and do sensitivities with your own bias parameters as modelers. Explore its importance if you're going to use one. And I suggest working backwards because some models have targets for decarbonization, for penetration rates in 2030, 2050. Work backwards from those to tell you what changes do you need in technology if you don't change behavioral aspects, or conversely, if you have some fixed projections of cost, Is that going to get you there? If not, then we know we need behavioral changes, and we need changes in the marketplace in terms of how people react to these technologies. That's insightful. So those are my incremental changes. The deeper integration stuff is really foxing me. Because honestly, and this is a question to all of you that I want us to think about, especially qualitative researchers. Let's say we had a clean slate. Okay, we think this has to be done right. We're going to do it right in phase 2. How are we going to construct a survey to really get at decision rules people are using in the best way possible? That's not just asking for factors, that's capturing a process. And I keep thinking that something about what Chris did, because then he did ultimately ask, why did you make the decision, right? An open-ended kind of an interview like that, I think this is an important way. But then there's your participatory, research methods, your focus groups, and the difficulties, or even there, if I remember right from our meeting, discussing the results, it looked like people were just bringing up factors and not really discussing processes. So how do we get at this? How, if we were to do it ourselves? I would love to figure out, based on all our collective learnings, I would love for this to be a topic of discussion when we meet, and maybe come up with some approach that we can put into this report for how we want to move forward, or in the presentation. So I'm just throwing it out there. I don't think we need to discuss it, but certainly any questions, any comments, any suggestions for me, I will appreciate. Like I said, my open questions are presentation about a more formal, statistics about the lit review, about tables, and their inclusion, and any ideas for the way forward. I'll stop there. And now I'm going to read the chat quietly while you all think about questions.
So on the table, I really like tables because I think there are different people reading the review, and some might just want to have the bigger picture and they might not look at the table. But if somebody like a PhD student wants to build an agent-based model on this, I think the tables are super helpful to get an overview. And on the more formal statistical, like searching with keywords and so on, I'm not so sure, but I think sometimes it gives the review more kind of rigor or credibility, because you might have looked at all of them anyways, and just if you say that you did it more like with a specific process behind, I think people might perceive it as more rigorous than otherwise, although it's basically the same. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was leaning towards that in the second part. On the first part, thank you. So somebody does want to read the tables, then that's good. Oh, Tammy, I think this is an important question. And this is an important thing I should bring up, which I didn't, about across the pond, the differences. Most people are looking at central systems, not mini splits. But there's a key technology difference between Europe and the US. And the US is almost exclusively air-to-air heat pumps, whereas in the US it's almost exclusively air-to-water heat pumps, hydronic heat pumps. Because the distribution system in the Europe is almost always water, especially under the floor or baseboard radiators. It's more efficient. And the US is almost exclusively air, which I think would primarily affect the cost, but it does affect your perception of comfort. It's a much slower process of it's a slower process of heating your home, and it goes better with a much better insulated home where you don't have that much variation. Whereas if you have a home that's very leaky, the forced air works well because you instantly get a blast of hot air on your face. Whereas, so yeah, it does matter.
This might be slightly tangential, but in terms of independent variables or predictive factors, I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who's a researcher on a slightly different topics in continental Europe. We talked about finances and how people think about debt, and how debt is used in different parts of the world. And the least conversation I had with him was that debt and taking on debt to make home improvements and things like that was conceptualized or thought of in very different ways in different parts of the world. And so I think there's a tendency to, I've done this in my own work, to try to reuse scales or reuse indicators from across continents, across national contexts, and maybe they don't actually mean the same thing at times, right? So, and we know that financial considerations loom large for households, but what we're seeing in the literature from Finland might not actually, might not work as well in the U.S. where one of the things that we found in a survey we did was that people in the U.S. report extremely high levels of debt aversion, which is strange because we have a lot of debt, much more so. Maybe what debt means is a different thing, I guess.
Well, I think that's a super important point. And maybe for that one, that's actually a good point. If I should, there's one study in the US that does look at that. People prefer rebates to financing for heat pumps, Other than that, there would be a ton of stuff in the home energy upgrade literature on debt and how that, and people having an upfront cost issue, needing financing. And that's more of a justice issue as well in terms of low cost. So yeah, that's a great point. I don't think I've seen anything on that, especially for heat pumps. People may hate debt, but have no choice,
That's true too.
Tammy, this theory of planned behavior is not, the part of the theory is that people's decisions are influenced by their sense of agency.
Yeah, and I know that. So I was just wondering how you see that as as playing into its use in this context. Like, is it something we don't know, so people just make it up, or is it?
Yeah.
How does it affect the implementation of the theory and the model?
I mean, to me, it's just assumed in these ABMs. And it's a motivation for asking the questions around your sense of inertia or agency. So I just find it's not necessarily, I don't know if that's how people are making decisions. It's just assumed to be.
It's in there, but it's like it's in there, but it's not really in the theory because we don't have any grounding for how we're using it. That's my sense.
Yeah, right.
Narasimha, we're near the end of time, and so I think this was great. It was a great summary of what you've found and where we are. What would be helpful for you? I know you want to discuss this question red, so I think that's we can get that on the agenda. We are dedicating a chunk of that meeting to what we would do going forward. Are there other things that would be helpful for you to get from other people, reflections or contributions on particular pieces of the review or the presentation? And then Ryan had a question. So maybe you can respond to that first, Narasimha, and then we'll take Ryan's question and close.
I can't think of anything else unless I've missed some literature or something like that. You won't know that unless you look at my reference list. But I would just turn to Ryan's question because it's about the red question, which is my main question.
Well, I wanted to add a complexity to it. Like, I think Chris's questions work great. The one thing I worry about is there's especially with housing, there's such a strong literature on recall bias and post hoc justifications. And I don't know that I've ever seen anyone do a good job of considering that. And I'd like us to actually be able to think about that if we can.
Yeah, exactly. You have a hypothetical bias if it's a case where you're asking people before, and then you have a post hoc whatever justification bias. So I don't know. Are you supposed to sit and observe people making these decisions somehow? I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, good point, Ryan. But so how should we do it, you know?
Well, we should not run away from it, right? So let's keep that in mind.
I guess the main thing to me is, you know, they're all smart people doing all this work. Obviously, there's good reasons why there are these gaps in literature, you know, in the modeling and in the field work and everything. So these are hard questions.
Mm.
Like, to me, I would love to be able to get at people who like got a project bid and then decided not to do it. And I know people are doing that, but there's how do you find those people? Like, if you could work with a contractor and be like, hey, you know, did you bid a heat pump and then not install it? Like, those are the people I want to talk to, because something's happening in their decision process that I'm not sure we're reflecting.
Mhm.
That's interesting, yeah.
It's not as heat pump specific, but we have some data that for just kind of energy efficiency more generally from that we could use from the city of Fort Collins to answer that. People that got an energy audit that didn't take the program any further. And some of those would be people who might have considered a heat pump. But I do agree there is significant potentially significant recall bias issues. I'm not sure what a study design looks that could sort of like you'd almost need to track homes that were at risk, as it were, of heat pump adoption over time, and then find ones that made the decision and then kind of collect data at different points in time to see how the decision making process is. It would be really neat if you could, but that's really what the literature needs.
But you know, I don't know why can't we just do a broad-based survey? Imagine if we had data on heat pump sales and we went and asked every single household that bought a heat pump recently, what happened? Did something break? Did the price go up? What reason? You know, I don't see why there would be any bias in just simply of asking what precipitated this. If you ask about preferences and attitudes and stuff, I can imagine all sorts of biases. But if you simply ask about the trigger, I can see that as being potentially objective. It doesn't help the selection process, I know, but it's at least the trigger phase.
Cool. Well, I think we should close now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for providing so much fodder for our in-person meeting. There will be both formal and informal discussions around this, I'm sure. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend and good luck with your panel, Narasimha.
Thank
Not
you.
dead.
Thank you. Bye.